Good afternoon. My name is John Lindahl, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the Museum of Nebraska History on the third Thursday of every month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all the Historical Society's programs and the services, can be found on our website, which is nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to broadcast these programs to a larger audience on public access television. Our speaker today is Bob Puschendorf. He's Associate Director for the Nebraska State Historical Society. He also serves as Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. He has retraced the route of the historic Meridian Highway through Nebraska. He's conducted field work on historic places associated with highway development and the automobile in Nebraska. His research on both the history of the Standard Oil Company in Nebraska and the commercial evolution of automobile filling stations has resulted in the nomination of several properties that are now listed in the National Register of Historic Places. This is a very good time for him to be speaking. We're talking about higher gas prices in the news today, and he'll probably talk about some of the gasoline prices from the past. His topic today is a Nebraska institution, the Standard Oil Company in Nebraska. Let's welcome Bob Puschendorf.
Welcome, and welcome to all those folks that are joining us on 5 City TV. We probably all know the story of John D. Rockefeller. He's been considered the caricature of big business and monopoly. Robber baron, lots of other names were given to him. And his Standard Oil Trust became what was once called an octopus, grabbing other oil companies, sometimes politicians, and resulting in a virtual monopoly of the oil industry in the last quarter of the 19th century. But Nebraska holds a somewhat unique position in that story, and it's also a story of a lot of coincidences. So today my story will give you an idea of the rest of the story of the Standard Oil Company. The Standard Oil Company entered Nebraska shortly after 1878. The company had identified lucrative markets in the West, and they organized establishing a district office in Omaha. Most, if not all, of their business at that time was domestic marketing and wholesaling. They brought in barrels of products, and they brought in bulk products through tank cars, stored them, and through distribution stations, then wholesaled them to jobbers or local oil peddlers who then sold them in their local regions and local markets. And eventually those distribution stations were located in Omaha, Lincoln, Beatrice, Nebraska City, Hastings, Norfolk, Grand Island, Kearney, and Fremont. At the time, the primary means of distributing liquid petroleum products was through wooden barrels. And as I said, they sold these on commission basis to local jobbers and oil peddlers. One of the most important functions of these early distribution stations were the cooper shops. At the time, the primary product for the company and for oil companies of the time was kerosene. And gasoline, because of its volatile and explosive nature, was first seen only as a useless byproduct. And some crude oil yielded some 20% of gasoline. Eventually, Standard Oil developed markets for this gasoline through heating stoves, cooking stoves, and for lighting. Some of the early uses for lighting were in large houses, hotels, some businesses that had equipment installed to turn the gasoline into gas. And by noting a number of instances of major fires, that probably wasn't the safest mechanism for lighting your business. But by far, its most extensive system of marketing was through bulk stations and tank wagon delivery. And you've all heard of the statement of eliminating the middleman. That's what Standard Oil did with these bulk stations. Smaller quantities of products were distributed through bulk stations and then through tank wagons. Another important function was direct marketing to farmers through tank wagon delivery. These bulk stations were often rather small, sometimes metal buildings or frame buildings. They were built along railroad right-of-way. Obviously, the petroleum products were brought in by railroad through tank cars, and other products were brought in through the railroad, and then they were stored in tanks. And this system of bulk stations continued to be the company's primary marketing method in Nebraska for many years. Retailers supplied petroleum to city folks, but farmers apparently had a greater market for petroleum products. They used kerosene in lamps, cook stoves, heaters, incubators, and gasoline use came with stationary engines that were used for corn shelling and feed grinding and pumping water. The establishment of the tank wagon system was an ambitious one, comparable only to rural farm delivery. And the tank wagon driver became very well known for bringing news to local farmers, very well liked, building up a very local, very good clientele. And one thing they were very proud of, the company painted their wagons with red running gear, green tanks, and orange signing. And to quote one York, Nebraska tank wagon driver, in his advertising he said, "Rain or shine, I don't care. Wilson and his mules will show be there. Should you need me before my regular trip, call 67 York, I'll come lickety-clip." Well, 1906 was a very important date for the Standard Oil Company. By 1906, the huge combination of Standard Oil was confronted with about 22 major court cases. In Nebraska, a gift to the university to build what we know today as the Temple Building was arousing a great number of people, tainted money, and as they said at the time. And it was in 1906 that they incorporated in Nebraska. And again, using the word coincidence, within days of the federal government announcing that it was going to take action against the Standard Oil combination. That led to a 1911 Supreme Court case in which the great Standard Oil Company was divided into 34 independent companies. And it's the result of that that I bring you the rest of the story. It was with that incorporation that Nebraska became an independent company of the Standard Oil Company. And it's also by coincidence that the year 1911 marked the age of the automobile in Nebraska and nationwide. The coming of the automobile opened vast new markets for petroleum products. Just to give you an idea of the growth of the automobile, in 1905, when the state of Nebraska first registered motor vehicles, there were 571 automobiles registered in the state. By 1911, there were 18,000 automobiles registered, and by 1919, there were 198,000 automobiles in the state. And Nebraska led the nation for a number of years during that period as having the most automobiles per capita, not the most number of automobiles, but the most number of automobiles per person. And so it was gasoline that drove the age of the automobility, as they once called that. And I have a quote here that I just couldn't refuse, or just couldn't neglect putting in here. A humorist at the time, this was in 1913, said, quote, "Gasoline was originally used for cleaning gloves and ejecting hired girls through the kitchen roof. but has now been taught a variety of tricks, such as running automobiles, aeroplanes, motorboats, windmills, streetcars, hearses, corn shellers, and bicycles. By the aid of gasoline, we can travel 60 miles an hour through the air, 150 miles over the land, and 6 feet into the ground with the greatest of ease. A gallon of gasoline can do as much in an hour as a horse can do in a day, and it doesn't have to be fed and bedded down at night. It can drive an automobile 20 miles, and while doing this can cause 3 runaways, a collision, a $20 speed fine for speeding, a divorce suit, and an inquest. A gallon of whiskey at a Saturday night dance can cause a great deal of trouble, but it is tame and kittenish beside a gallon of whiz water, which is conducting a joyride. Gasoline is a clear, nervous liquid which is composed of speed, noise, and trouble in equal parts. It is made of kerosene reduced to a more violent stage, and it is kindly supplied to the restless portion of mankind by the fragments of the late Standard Oil Company. It was the automobile that focused the nation's attention on good roads, the improvement of roads, both to accommodate local trade and farm trade, but also about this time, long-distance automobile trails, the predecessors of what we would call today's highways and today's highway system. By 1918, there were 38 automobile trails in Nebraska, given colorful names such as the Grainland Highway, the Blue Pole Road, the Alfalfa Road, of course the Lincoln Highway, and the Meridian Highway. Well, how were cars serviced with the coming of the automobile? And it's really an evolution. At first, stores sold gasoline to the automobile user. He could buy it direct from the bulk stations, and he could also have it delivered to his home. The most avid motorist found it all the most efficient. Whoops. Now I'm doing it. Sorry about this technical defect on my part. Sorry about that, a technical deficiency on my part. The most avid motorist could actually equip his own garage with an underground storage tank and an indoor or outdoor pump, and then have the tank wagon delivered to his own home. Obviously, these were quite inefficient ways of filling an automobile. In the case of the tanks at at grocery stores and stores that sold gasoline, it meant filling up a bucket and taking it to the automobile with a funnel, lining the funnel with gauze or a chamois cloth, and then placing the gasoline into the car. And if the car's engine was hot, you can imagine what that would result in. Again, the evolution and actually bringing the car to drive-in service or drive-up service first began with curbside gas pumps. And these were placed in front of grocery stores, hardware stores, general merchandise stores, and I've even found out where they were placed in front of pool halls. The pumps themselves, like this one, it's a very early pump, could also be found in garages, either placed indoors or outdoors. Obviously, garages were very common locations to buy gasoline. And of course, liveries, the time serving the horse, were also good locations for the curbside pump, and they symbolically served to supplant the horse. The earliest filling stations, and probably a property that we would recognize today as a filling station, appeared in Nebraska probably by about 1914 or 1915. The first ones were pretty crude affairs, metal buildings, sheds, sometimes they were called shacks. At the time, gasoline was a seasonal business. People stored their cars over the winter and brought them out in the spring, and so the gasoline station began business in the spring and probably went through fall until cold weather came along. Standard Oil of Nebraska built its first gasoline station, which was described as a common metal shed at 12th and Q Street in 1914. But it was very soon and later in that year that they introduced a gasoline station that was designed by an architect and could be probably best described as a brick bungalow, little brick building with a nice little roof with a nice design on it. And if Standard Oil was not the first in Nebraska to develop a gasoline station, it was certainly the first to extensively market across the state through filling stations. And the example with the Standard Oil, the architect designed filling station for Standard Oil, is probably one of the first, the nation's first examples of standardized plans by a practicing architect to be applied to filling stations, even nationwide. The Standard Oil Company had quite an inheritance from the 1911 Supreme Court decision. It had a network of about 347 bulk stations in Nebraska. It had, serving this network, it had an outreach to virtually every portion of the state. And with that came its greatest expansion and competition. And I'll mention here a nice little quote about competition in the early 1920s. The entry of new people and new capital into the petroleum marketing business has been so rapid that the industry has been under a strain to assimilate them. The marketing business today is much the same in position as the producing business was several years ago. Everyone in it would like to get out of it, and everybody out would like to get in. The 1920s saw the greatest expansion of the Standard Oil Company in Nebraska. It was the year that they built their first headquarters building, the first that they occupied themselves. And that building still stands at 504 South 18th Street in Omaha. They built several large warehouse and distribution plants, Hastings, North Platte, and great expansions of their existing distribution stations in Omaha and Lincoln. The 1920s also marked its greatest expansion statewide of its filling stations. Its major gasoline product was Red Crown gasoline, and they proudly called their new stations Red Crown service stations. And they eventually built about 207 stations in Nebraska. And these stations were company built and company operated. They were operated by employees of the Standard Oil Company. The Standard Oil Company owned the land and the buildings. Also in their elaborate marketing system, in 1921 they introduced their first of a series of road maps, which were called automobile trails, map of marked automobile trails in Nebraska. These were free road maps, and of course they became a very common marketing device used by gasoline companies well into the present. And they were said to be the first company of the Standard Oil group of companies that were broken from the Standard Oil combination to issue free road maps. So they were leading in some ways leading the nation in some of their marketing. Well, by the 1930s, we brought in a period of Great Depression, virtual collapse of the agricultural market. The registration of automobiles peaked in 1929. Nebraska at the time had 375,000 automobiles registered, and that number wouldn't be exceeded until 1948. And with the great expanse of the automobile in the previous years and the expanse and production of gasoline and petroleum products, competition certainly hit the marketplace. While some companies, such as Standard Oil, expanded their product lines with 3 grades of gasoline, a grade of ethyl gasoline, of course their Red Crown gasoline, and Reliance, which was their lowest price gasoline. And they had intended to introduce a product called Nebraska Blue. In the early 1930s, companies were coloring their gasoline in different colors to make it seem as though the gasoline was a better quality than it was. And one writer of the time warned against what he called the hokum of cheap gasoline. And he said, "The imposing array of signs which greet the eye of the motorist, announcing gasoline at an assortment of cut prices, presents a problem that is far-reaching. To buy or not to buy is the question facing every motorist. The motorist may well pause and wonder when he looks at the sign offering gasoline at a low figure, whether that sign means gasoline cheap or cheap gasoline. Perhaps occasionally the gas behind the sign is really good gas, but in the large number of cases the gasoline is cheap gasoline, often colored to hide the yellowness that betrays its short acquaintance with the refinery and a close association with sulfur." With low price margins on gasoline, many companies, such as the Standard Oil group of companies, entered into expanded lines of products for automobiles. The Atlas Company served Standard Oil of Nebraska and a number of other Standard Oil companies. They collaborated in the establishment of the Atlas Company, and Atlas supplied tires, batteries, and other accessories for the automobile. You could get heaters for your car, you could get visors for your car, just a whole number of accessories. And these more profitable lines overcame the small margins that were provided in selling gasoline. It was also at this time that companies were expanding their services to mechanical repairs, and what we could call the true service station evolved to accommodate those expanded products and services. The expansion into these service and product lines meant that Standard Oil gas stations had to be remodeled or rebuilt, accommodating display space for their products, large display windows, using techniques of merchandising at the time to show their products to the drive-in motorist, service bays either attached to the building or detached next to existing stations. And again, with a little coincidence and irony, the progressive marketing techniques that Standard Oil was once excelled in also left the company in pretty bad condition in the 1930s. At one time they had built their huge method of distribution through bulk stations, and now they found their bulk stations to be inefficient. They were tied to railroads. In many cases the bulk stations were built on land leased from the railroads, and they were tied to high freight rates that were being charged by railroads at the time. And motorized truck transport was coming into its own with improved highways at the time, and competitors were finding it much more efficient to transport gasoline products from the mid-continent fields of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas by driving straight north into Nebraska on some of the improved north-south highways that we had at the time. Standard Oil had built a huge number of filling stations in the 1920s, and these were all found to be very outdated. The canopies that once were attached to every Standard Oil station could no longer accommodate larger cars and trucks. They were providing 3 products, and those had to be located under the canopy. The pumps had to be located under the canopy. The early stations were just very small boxes, and they did not provide, with the exception of an outdoor grease pit, did not provide for very much service and mechanical work. And Standard Oil, although it saw yearly sales of some $5 to $6 million, accumulated staggering losses over the period of the 1930s, averaging about $250,000 each year. And in 1934 alone, they lost $600,000 in their business operations. So it was apparent that the company could not continue much longer, although they had a great number of real estate holdings, cash holdings. The restlessness on the part of the stockholders required them to start looking at an option to either expand with another company that had production and refining capacity, or as they looked into the sale of the company in 1939 to Standard Oil of Indiana. And that was a very good move, actually, because Standard Oil of Indiana was supplying most, if not all, of the products for Standard Oil of Nebraska. At the time, Standard Oil of Indiana was in 15 states, and Nebraska was right in the middle of their marketing territory. Standard Oil of Nebraska had its marketing facilities in place, and so it was a very logical purchase by Standard Oil of Indiana. In 1939, the Standard Oil of Nebraska only held 9% of Nebraska's marketing. At one time, it held as much as 85%, and that was the lowest of all the Standard Oil operations of surrounding states. Well, the sale of Standard Oil of Nebraska ended its period as a unique independent company, and many of today's former Standard Oil group of companies have probably exceeded anything that would have been imagined by John D. Rockefeller when he organized the business in the 1870s. Standard Oil of Indiana became a subsidiary of the American Oil Company and went nationwide in its marketing. We're probably most familiar today with the sign of the Standard Oil Company and the Amoco trade name that has been in use for a number of years. And again, with irony, Standard Oil is now a division, or now has been merged with British Petroleum. What had been a great American legend is now affiliated with BP, or British Petroleum, a foreign company. The company tries to downplay its foreign roots by simply the initials BP, and sometimes they advertise that as Beyond Petroleum, but they are a foreign company. And in 2002, the signs of Amoco and Standard Oil started to come down. And just July 1st of this year, I know my neighborhood gas station, the Amoco, its sign came down, and I believe all the signs now in Lincoln and perhaps the rest of Nebraska have come down. And of course, with the signs, the great legend of the Standard Oil Company in America. So with that, I would entertain any questions you might have. Yes?
Are there any stations like that one you showed there from the 1920s still in Nebraska?
There are several. I think in my work I've identified about 20 that are still standing in lots of disrepair or with a lot of additions and modernizations, and there's probably less than 10 that stand where you would recognize them as one of these stations in the picture. The one that I showed in the picture is one in Ogallala that has been completely restored and serves as a visitor center right on the edge of downtown Ogallala. So it's it's one that we've had an opportunity to work with and one that we're very proud of.
Any other towns where they're quite recognizable?
There's one in Venango, and it's been converted to a little apartment. There's one in Palisade. The one that I showed you, the more modern one with the gabled front, that one's located in Red Cloud. That's still standing. And there are a few other ones that we found in Plattsmouth. There's one where the canopy has been removed, but of course the canopy was removed historically from the station, and so it still stands there. Once you get to recognize the roof line, the cornice on the roof, they had a row of light bulbs around the cornice, the distinctive brickwork. You can walk up to a station that is suspected to be an early Standard Oil station, and you can kind of pick out some of those details even today.
What's that one on the north end of Main Street in Shadron? It's part of a building plan? North of the old Main Street Inn, isn't there?
Jim asked about a gas station in Shadron north of the Main Street Inn, and I have to admit
It's up by the railroad tracks. I guess I thought there was...
yes, you're right. You're right. That is an early Standard Oil station. The canopy has been infilled with brick, but in all other ways, the essence of the entire building is still there. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, there's a remnants of one on South 11th Street here in Lincoln. You have to know what you're looking for because the canopy's been taken off. Unfortunately, the windows have been either blocked or painted over. Painted battleship gray. It's on the west side of South 11th. Approximately where Everett School used to be. School's still there.
Okay. Well, that's one I'll be sure to search down.
Yeah, it's there. Then there is a station with a canopy in St. Paul, Nebraska, about a block off of Main Street.
Okay.
I don't know if it was a Standard Oil station or not, but it does have the canopy. It's maintained by Parkland there. So
Yes, I read about that. That wasn't a Standard Oil station, but it's a very well-preserved frame or stucco station.
yeah, it's a nice. Yeah, it's preserved. It's very nice.
Yeah, the little stations with the canopies were very, very popular in the 1920s, and you probably see more of just the generic canopy-type stations still standing in Nebraska than you probably will see a Standard Oil station. There's also one at 18th and O. Bigler Motors just moved out of it. It's across directly west of the old Duteau Chevrolet building, and that's one of the early Standard Oil stations that was designed as a service station. I believe it has 3 car bays. When it was designed, it originally had a canopy as well. It had room for 5 pumps in the front, so that is one of them that you can still see, and it looks about as it did from the original building plans, which we have in our collections here at the Nebraska State Historical Society. Yes?
Were all the properties sold off in the 30s then when they merged with Standard Oil and Indiana?
Yeah, the question was, were all the properties sold off when they were merged to Standard Oil Company of Indiana? All of the stations were transferred to a new company called Standard Oil of Nebraska, which was more or less a sales division of Standard Oil of Indiana. Those properties were all formally transferred to Standard Oil of Indiana in 1944. They remained in Standard Oil ownership or American Oil ownership, many of them, a great many of them, I think until perhaps about the 1960s, and then they started disposing of the properties. Standard Oil in the 1930s here in Nebraska started to lease a lot of its stations, operating them by company employees. I guess became rather costly, and so they leased them to local operators, and then local operators ran them on a commission basis. Others? Yes? The question was there one on 13th and F Street?
I think that building is still standing, but it's been,
There was one at 13th and J Streets, but that no longer stands. That was probably the first one of the new design that was built in 1914. so I'm not quite sure. Lynn?
I was intrigued by the brand name Polarine.
Yes.
You have any hints as to where that name came from? I mean, gasoline strikes me as sort of a hot topic, and so Polarine seems sort of like a non sequitur.
A colleague asked me about the name Polarine. Polarine was one of the major motor oil brands of Standard Oil Company, and it gets its name because they wanted to promote good starting power in wintertime. You all know that oil gets very, very thick in very cold weather, and it's hard to crank over a car in very cold weather. So Polarine was the name they gave to it. It's very interesting. There's a company called the Manhattan Oil Company, one of the very early independent companies that came up with the name Trop-Arctic Motor Oil. And they sold that to Phillips 66 when they merged with Phillips 66. And the Trop-Arctic name is still very well recognized. So there you have heat and cold. Okay. Other questions? Beulah?
Was the Coriel family associated with Standard Oil?
The Coriel, she asks if the Standard Oil Company was affiliated with Coriel. Not that I know of. They were one of the major competitors. Cut price, statewide, very early independent company. They date back to the 1880s. They operated a number of gas stations in the state, but if they had an affiliation with Standard Oil, it was probably as a competitor.
Well, there's still a Coriel Park, I think, someplace down the road toward Nebraska City or
Right.
I think I've been there once.
Coriel Park is a park located west of Auburn in southeast Nebraska, and that was built by the Coriel family of the gas and oil business.
And I think they also donated to the Foundation Garden, which is on M Street.
That could be. The upkeep and maintenance of Coriel Park is based on an endowment that they gave many years ago when that was developed. They also had apartment buildings, and L.L. Coriel was one of the early presidents of what was called the Nebraska Independent Oil Men's Association. It was a group of independent companies that looked out after their interests. Yes?
Well, obviously, the Standard in Nebraska was doing distribution and marketing, but the production and exploration was being done somewhere else by someone else. Do you know
That's correct.
where their product was primarily coming from?
The question was, Standard Oil of Nebraska was primarily a marketing and distribution organization company, and they were not in the producing of crude oil or the refining of crude oil. And that's true. The Supreme Court ruling left its mission to the marketing of petroleum in Nebraska. When it was incorporated in Nebraska, it was incorporated simply as a marketing company. I'm sorry to say Nebraska is not too well known for production of petroleum. I think some of the major producing wells in Nebraska came in much later, like 1949. So without producing capacity in Nebraska, there was obviously little refining capacity. And so Standard Oil of Nebraska got most, if not all, of its gasoline petroleum products from Standard Oil of Indiana. They had 3 huge refineries, one in Illinois, one in Missouri. They were involved in the oil fields and the refining of petroleum in Wyoming. Standard Oil of Kansas was a producing entity that came out of the Standard Oil combination of 1911, and they had a number of producing wells and refineries. So some of it came from Kansas, but the majority came from Casper, Wyoming, and the refineries of Standard Oil of Indiana, and as well as their products. Standard Oil of Indiana was really the developer of products like Polarine motor oil and just the huge number of byproducts that come out of petroleum. I think there's probably many thousands of new uses today. And they were the ones that had the organization that could do product development and experimentation. And Standard Oil of Nebraska largely followed their supplier by carrying those products that were developed by Standard Oil. Any other questions? Yes?
I know there's a big collector market now in anything dealing with gas stations and petroleum. Do you know how they originally got rid of their signs that they were changing out, or recently? What did they do with the signs that they recently?
I believe here in Lincoln, the major distributors have taken them back, and they're probably destroyed. Some of them were saved because somebody took some of those big, heavy, enameled metal signs and maybe nailed it to the side of their barn, maybe covering over a hole in the barn. Some oil men may have kept them as souvenirs. They're highly collectible, and there are several very noteworthy collections here in Lincoln, and one is at Speedway Motors at the Smith Auto Collection has a great number of early automobile-related products and signs on display, on exhibit. Thank you for bringing that up. And every year there is an oil and petroleum show in Des Moines, Iowa. And if you want to find a rare or scarce petroleum sign or container or oil can, you've got to go to it. Any more? We've got plenty of time, I believe. I would say that gasoline prices, about 1900, you could buy a gallon container of gasoline for 8 cents. After the operation of filling stations, the price probably ranged from about 21 cents or less. And sometimes when there were gas wars with the other cut price dealers, gasoline prices fell to as low as 8 3/4 cents a gallon. So, yes?
Do you remember what you paid for gassing your Mustang originally?
Well, someone in the audience is trying to date me. And back in my high school days, I drove a 1965 Mustang, and the question was, how much do I recall gasoline selling for at the time? Well, I remember going into a gas station and buying $1 worth, and that would buy you 3 or 4 gallons of gas, and you could cruise Main Street all night on that. Thank you very much.